Okay, so let me pull up my screen. All right. Brian, can you see that? My Brian, co-host Brian.
Yep, I can see it. Yep, everything's
Okay,
good.
all right. I'm a Google Meet guy, so sometimes I don't do this correctly. All right, so we're gonna apply the templates and the heuristics to Eyes, the man with the saxophone. So just as a reminder, in order for these templates to work, you're going to have to Bob Ross your instruction. And what I mean by that is you have to paint with your students. You just can't talk about these templates in the ether. So early in the academic year, when I'm presenting these templates to my students, I might say to them, all right, we're writing this essay about Hamlet. I am going to model for you how to do the declarative thesis 3 times. So I write the introduction with the declarative thesis 3 times and I show my students. All right, I'm also going to show you how to invert the thesis. I'm going to write it 3 times and I show it, we deconstruct it and I say, you've seen it 6 times, choose your poison, declare or invert, and do your introduction. So lots of modeling, lots of exemplars, really get students to grow, flourish, and mature as writers. So here's the prompt. In I's poem, The Man with the Saxophone, published in 1985, the speaker encounters a man playing a saxophone. Read the poem carefully, then in a well-written essay, analyze how I uses literary elements and techniques to convey the complexity of the speaker's encounter with the saxophone player at that particular time and place. So they didn't throw anything unusual, no curveballs at our students this year. That's pretty straightforward and germane and kind of in line with every other FRQ I've ever seen. So here's the kicker that I tell my students and when I push in to districts and work with teachers and departments. Implicit in every prompt, all right, especially for FRQ1 and FRQ2, and then I'll do a presentation for the Lang exam later on. This is especially true of the rhetorical analysis piece in Lang. Implicit in every prompt, you have 2 questions. What is the authorial intent and how does the author construct meaning? So when I work with teachers and they're pulling their hair out saying, why is my students writing so plot heavy, Christian? It reads like a Cliff Note summation to me. It reads like, a book report. I say, let's look at your prompt. And oftentimes prompts set students up to write book reports and things that read like Spark Notes. So I think if you, in your prompt, if you're implicitly or explicitly asking these 2 questions, if the student, constructs the thesis correctly, they're going to set the stage to perform literary analysis. Leave that open, Logan. So let's see here. How do I construct the introductory paragraph? Here's the deal. I tell my students that they can either declare or invert the thesis. There's only, for my templates, there's only 2 ways to go about it. To avoid students writing those 28 sentence long introductory paragraphs, the 14 sentence, the 8 sentence, the 1 sentence. When I'm teaching the templates early in the academic year, I eliminate choice. And I tell my students that I want the introduction to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less, exactly 4 sentences long. So when you declare the thesis, you're going to start with the thesis statement, just boom, as declaratively, succinctly, concisely as possible, drop the thesis. In the remaining 3 sentences, you're just going to provide context and background. All right. So there's other nuanced things that I teach in my master class and when I work with teachers. Sentence constructs are huge. We use a book called Write It Right by Strunk and White. And in it, they assert that there's 12 different ways to construct a sentence. So my students know how to yield and to manipulate all those sentence constructs. So you'll see them do that. I also do an intensive word study academy with my students and my teachers when I work with them. So you're going to see my students use a fair amount of what I call tier 2 level vocabulary, which is your basic average run-of-the-mill SAT level word. So that's the declarative. The inverted is when you start with context and background, and as you funnel it down towards the fourth sentence, you slip your thesis. So here's the kicker, all right? This makes life super easy for our students. For FRQ1, FRQ2, and FRQ3, you can use the inverted thesis every time. So I have my students only use the inverted thesis. And here's where it gets good. They answer the question, what is the authorial intent, in the opening line? And they're going to get like you're going to get like a thematic flow, a thematic focus. And as you funnel down or whittle it down towards the fourth sentence, you're going to answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? And getting the answer to those two questions, they're going to crush the thesis point. All right. It really sets them up nicely to do that. Here is my first example here. I gotta, hold on, my arrows are confusing me here. All right. So this is going to be inverted, starting with the question, what is the authorial intent? Some people find themselves blessed when they finally come to see beautiful things in humbly unexpected places. So that's kind of like the main gist of the poem, right? What is the authorial intent? What was I trying to do? While others look upon these exact spots in time and space and see nothing, a rare man can find the ethereal and divine. Juxtaposing the narrator's bleak humanness to the city's gradual early morning awakening, I conveys the transformation of his protagonist from his dark existence to his becoming one with an almost internal state of nirvana. Now, the last sentence, how does the author construct meaning? So this is the sentence where we want to see the terms and the devices. One of the things I don't want my students to do, and I see this in College Board sample papers a lot, I call it the lit term dump truck, where they just bring the truck up and dump a whole bunch of lit terms in there. And I especially see that in the students that are advised by their teacher to write the one sentence introduction. I think when you're using templates, you're not racing against the clock. So it's totally fine to get a 4-sentence bagger in here. So look at this last sentence. Through these motifs and the personification of the city and symbols of rebirth and rejuvenation, I suggest that one can find the eternal joys of life in its utter simplicity. So that's one example of how to do the inverted. Here's a totally different writer going to use the template to the exact same execution. What is the authorial intent? First sentence. One can say that deep human connection is the purpose and essence of having a meaningful life, right? That's another interpretation of the poem. It's correct. Like that's kind of the essence of what the poem's talking about. Further, once a person comes to this understanding of how to interact with life at this exact purpose, the most amazing acts of love, humanness, and generosity can arise. Sometimes in the hustle and bustle of life, we need a reminder to slow down just long enough to see the value of humanity's beauty and appreciate what it is to just be alive in this space and time. Now, end again with, how does the author construct meaning? Hit me with the thesis statement, last sentence, invert it. I conveys this message through the juxtaposition of the awakening city and the spiritual awakening of his narrator through the symbols of rebirth and personal growth. So 2 for 2 done the exact same way. So what is the authorial intent? It's going to take 3 sentences to answer that question, right? Sprinkle heavy focus on the theme. Last sentence, the 4th sentence, how does the author construct meaning? Here's one more. Music is one of the most predominant things that can yield a catharsis. While self-inflicted misery and pure joyfulness can be intensely attractive states of being on their own, when the two live side by side, great moments can be created while paradoxically negating the former. Personal growth can sometimes spark from the nowhere of unexpected places, But when one finds themselves on the threshold of obtaining a state of heightened awareness from a seemingly trite thing such as a corner musician, the effect can be beyond profound. Last sentence again, how does the author construct meaning? I arrives at this idea through the personification of the city landscape and the allusions to higher spiritual principles. So this is how my students tackled the introduction this year for this year's exams. Every exam, this is how you can do FRQ 1 through 3 with this particular template, and it's a gold mine. So when I'm teaching composition to my students, we do take a look at what other teachers are doing, especially those that have a YouTube presence that are in our groups. And a number of them talk about the one sentence introduction, like just get the thesis point. And I'm opposed to that because I firmly believe, I know I do this, and when I talk to other teachers, I'm like, subjectively, do you do this? And if they think about it, I've never heard a teacher say no to this question. At the end of the introductory paragraph, do you immediately place the kid on the rubric and say to yourself, dude, cool, this is headed towards a 5 or a 6, this is exceptional, or here's a 2, oh my goodness, right? I do that. And I think with the one sentence introduction, it's, for me, I just don't think it's a good first impression. I expect my students to be able to do more, because we practice so much and they are using templates and heuristics. All of them can write 3 essays in 2 hours doing a 4-sentence introduction. I have a couple of EKers every year that are pressed for time and have a hard time finishing, but if they had like 10 hours on the exam, I think they would still be pressed for time. But that's just the nature of slow writing. So that's how I instruct the introductions. So let's move on to the body paragraphs. I tell my students to write syllogistic body paragraphs. So we got to talk about what a syllogism is for a little bit. And you guys that are versed in classic rhetoric, you'll know what I'm talking about. But for those that don't, I'll just give a very brief overview. In my master class and when I push into districts and work with teachers, we spend a ton of time on this because it's really at the core of how to tackle the body paragraph. But I'll just give you a flavor for it, like a general understanding, so you can see what my students are doing. So the syllogism comes from Aristotle, and he ran a school called the Lyceum back in the old days. And the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, rhetoric, debate, the math, and the sciences. So they might throw out a topic like, what is justice? And they would word wrangle it for days and months, kind of like what you saw in Plato's Republic. What is justice? And, Socrates would take on the world, and each man would throw out a syllogism basically to defend his definition of justice. So in terms of what a syllogism is, it's like a mathematical computation where you argue from one premise to a second premise to a conclusion. So here's an example. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. So I call that cogency, right? In classic rhetorical terms, we want our students to be cogent, like super locked in, logical, well-reasoned. So here's another one. Premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog's going to die. I just realized like all my examples are super morbid. So sorry about that. They were kind of bleak. But when we look at College Board sample papers, oftentimes what I see is students only presenting the second premise. And that's why when I read them and when we read our students' writing, they're so plot heavy. They're not being logical. They're not being well reasoned in terms of offering that first premise and the conclusion. It's 100% pure second premise. So we got to get students away from that, especially since the demand of the assignment is to perform literary analysis. So in terms of breaking down that syllogistic method for the purposes of performing literary analysis, here's a cute little trick. So the first premise is going to be the statement that contains your terms and devices. I tell my students that I want this first premise to be 3 sentences long. As we know on the Lang exam for the synthesis essay, the College Board says your argument must be central. They say it 3 times in the directions. And I tell my students that for every expository mode, your argument must be central, because in expository writing, you're arguing, whether or not you're doing literary analysis, rhetorical analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, research, you're always arguing. So I want that argument to be central, and I want it to have a literary focus. So use terms or devices. The second premise is going to be the textual support. And what I like to see here is this nice teeter-totter balance of quoting and paraphrasing. I don't want one done so much more at the expense of the other. It has to be in kilter. It has to balance each other out. And then the conclusion of the syllogism. So it's called a syllogistic body paragraph. So we're not talking the conclusion of the essay. So like paragraph 5, we're talking the conclusion of the syllogism is your textual analysis and links. So I often say to my students that the first premise is a promise, and it's the handshake back to your reader. I promised that I would argue certain things in this body paragraph, and now I'm just putting a bow on it in the end. So you want to hear like the echo of the first premise and the echo of the thesis in the conclusion of the syllogism. So students often ask me this, Mr. Kuhn, you want the introductory paragraphs to be exactly 4 sentences long. How many sentences should a syllogistic body paragraph be? I love that question because, one, some teachers say, oh no, you're taking the organic nature of writing out. Now you're teaching formulas, you're doing paint by numbers. And I say, nope. I think a good girthy body paragraph should be about 10 sentences long, give or take. And I tell my students, hard cap, I don't want you going over 12 sentences, because then you're just bloviating or going on bird walks, or you're getting too plot heavy. So magic number is 10. So the first 3 sentences are the first premise, and we need to set up the argument with a literary focus. Students often ask this, where do I begin my analysis? And I tell them, start right where the poem starts. Start where I starts and methodically work through it. That's how you achieve logic. That's reasoning. So right from the onset of the poem, I sets up his main theme, that sometimes the biggest epiphanies arise from seemingly insignificant things. Through personifying certain aspects of the city, he creates the central juxtaposition of the narrator's transformation from a state of bleakness to a state of what is almost a divine place of spirituality. Alluding to a variety of theologies, I arrives at how one can attain a heightened awareness of their humanness. All right, so the argument is set up, but here's the kicker with a first premise. Do you see how this student is multitasking? There's a variety of literary terms and devices at play here. They got theme, personification, and juxtaposition. Themes implied, though, that's a given, but they also have the allusion to the theologies. So this is ambitious. There's many things to talk about here, because if you're going to get the totality of the poem, and students do 1 lit term at a time, that's going to be like a 13 paragraph essay, and we just don't have time. So the first premise in terms of reading allows the students to see how the pieces intersect with each other to unify the work as a whole. So like, what does a syntactical shift have to do with the formation of a different tone, right? So those types of things we want our students to be able to identify. So when we move to the second premise, we're into the textual support, teeter-totter balance, the quoting and the paraphrasing. From the beginning of the poem, we are told that it is 5 a.m. and that the streets are empty, but as the city gradually awakens, the manhole covers seem alive, and the white hair that bearded the face of the city is brittle and unrecognizable. So let's talk about what my students are doing here. I love it when my students can embed their quotes. And there's an easy trick to get them to do this. So as I read that, I hope you recognize that it was very conversational. You don't hear the quotes, they're not abrupt. And one little gimmick that I have to get students to write that supplely is I call it the 5-word rule. If you place a minimum, so a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keep the quote small, it should sound conversational. So what this student is doing here is real tight diction analysis, just pulling apart the words of the poem and plucking it in the paper. I love it when they can do that. That's real high skill writing. That's like the pinnacle of good composition right there. I love that. So let's move on. The portrayal of this personified landscape can be juxtaposed to the eventual awakening of the narrator. In a sense, he's asleep because at this stage of his amble, he's earthbound and solitude is his companion. So one of the things you'll see my students do is use brackets quite a bit. I tell them that's fine. You don't want to like totally bastardize the poem and overuse brackets. You gotta keep it, true to the poem. But using brackets so that you're sounding conversational in your embedded quotes is totally fine. Defeated by life and apparently forlorn, he insists that we don't try to tell him otherwise. He's had it all and lost it and never wants it back. Life can pummel us into such a submission. So it goes on. I got to move your pictures are over my text. Sometimes we find ourselves wandering the possibilities of turning ourselves into a bird like the shaman we are meant to be, but our negative and fixed mindsets get in the way. But sometimes something comes along to sweep us off our feet. The mind can empty like the Buddhists tell you is possible if only you don't try, and you can find yourself mercifully opening into the unforgiving new day. A mere man with a saxophone can do this. Such a man in such a moment can transform one into the unencumbered bird of imagination. So that's plenty of support, plenty of analysis. And if we go back to where we began, did the student keep their promise? Are we talking about juxtapositions, personifications, and the spiritual illusions? So far, yes. So all the textual support, all the quotes, all the paraphrasing need to be germane to the promise that's made in the first premise. That's how you argue in composition like arsenic is deadly, my dog ate arsenic, my dog's going to die. We want them to be that bulletproof and that locked in. So in the conclusion, you're making your links and you also want to hear the echoes of the thesis and the first premise. The manner in which the poem ends brings the transformation full circle, and that the notes of the musician are compared to a black flower, a symbol of rebirth and rejuvenation. The narrator, bleak and forlorn at the crack of dawn, awakens just as the city does into a new state of being that is divine in nature. This transformation arises from simplicity, a simplicity that usually accompanies such an epiphany. So that was 11 sentences, I think. So that's the syllogistic method for the man with the saxophone. That's how my students tackled their body paragraphs. Those are some of the nuances and the flares that they were able to do by using this template. And it's the culmination of, intense word study throughout the year, intense focus on how to manipulate syntactical features and to wield those complex sentences like that. We started the day after Labor Day and went all the way till May, the time of the exam. So worked it every day. Lots of writing workshops. Me, Bob Ross, and the heck out of this for them to be able to pull this off. But most of my students, I had 78. As we know, scores aren't back yet, but I think I should be upper 80s, lower 90s in terms of qualification with, a very diverse group of kids. So I find that once my students can master these templates, it ultimately comes down to their reading. And this poem was very accessible for most of my students. Very few of them came back and said, this one stumped me. I couldn't quite figure it out. We had done enough poetry whereby they were comfortable with this one. So I will stop sharing my screen, and my co-host can throw some questions my way. So Brian, Katrina, or Maria,
Okay, a couple of questions we had, and there are some people listing questions right now. Natalia Romero asked, I started asking my students not to use questions unless they absolutely had to. I try not to have rules of that sort, but I do discourage them from using questions because they don't use them well. I would love to learn some strategies to teach them how to use rhetorical questions well, because I do know that they can be very effective. So that's not directly related, but it's a question that she had. I don't know if you want to cover that now,
yeah,
or in the
I do
future.
teach them effective strategies to use the rhetorical question, but I'm the type of writing coach where I will say to a kid, please don't use rhetorical questions because you don't use them effectively. Like, why did Hamlet have to die? 'Tis the question. Like, they begin their essay that way. And it's like, no, like, don't begin your essay with a rhetorical question, please. So yeah, so certain students, I say, you understand the concept of how to use a rhetorical question, so it's fair game. Like, have at it, go for it. And the same for second person and first persons. Some students, they sound so awkward when they do it. It sounds contrived and a little too chummy, too colloquial. So I tell my students, I give them permission to do things on a one-on-one basis, and they know themselves as writers. Come time for the exam, we do so much writing, so much focus on writing in the lit class.
Another question we had was from Haley Murphy. She said, how many body paragraphs should students have? And I don't know if she is referring to on the AP exam.
Yep. On the exam, I have my students do intro to body conclusion. So 4 paragraphs. That seems to be good enough.
Oh, and I think someone actually did two paragraphs. Do you suggest students organize by shifts made by the author?
They can, definitely. The more nuanced writers definitely can do that. I do show them how to do that. It's more skillful, but you're struggling an emerging writer. I think the best way for me, at least, to teach them is to be methodic and go top, middle, bottom in terms of their analysis through the poem, and cross weave when necessary.
There's a discussion happening between several teachers. Someone prompted, Elisa said, if I myself wanting more analysis of the quotes, like the power of the word shaman or Buddhism, etc., it doesn't feel like there's maybe enough digging into the text. Is that just me? And some other people are thinking maybe needing more precision or clarification on that, wanting for more requoting and analysis. So what is your feeling on that?
Yeah, this student definitely could go a little deeper in that. For example, the first premise is talking about the allusion to spiritual concepts, and you have in that poem references to Buddhism and shamanism. And I would tell that student, you need to unpack that a little bit more. You stated it in your first premise, but in your second premise, in the analysis part, you kind of abandoned it, and it's implied, like, we kind of see where you're going with it, but you got to be more forthright than that in the analysis. I would want that student to unpack that with at least one sentence. It's probably going to take 2 sentences for them to draw that connection. So that's an excellent point. Yep.
Another person asked, I could use some clarification on the term premise. and how you present that to your students.
I teach my students straight up rhetoric. Aristotle's my homeboy in AP language and AP lit. So I do a lot of classical rhetoric with my students. So they get very well versed in logic. I tell them that in order to be a good writer, you have to be a good logician. You have to be able to think cogently and get locked in terms of your argument so that you're not bringing in extraneous information or going on bird walks or getting waylaid. So early in the academic year, we spend a lot of time laying the foundation for what a syllogism is, how to logic, how to think, how to reason on paper.
So you're taking your clarification or your definition of premise from Aristotle.
Yes.
Okay. I think that's all the questions right now at the moment.
Cool. All right. You want to go do FRQ 2? This is going to blow your world, I hope. Marie, is that visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
To me.
All right. So
Looks good.
we'll do the exact same thing with FRQ 2, the Tim Winton piece. So again, I don't need to say this. In order for this to work, Bob Ross, Bob Ross, Bob Ross. So here's the prompt. The following excerpt is from Tim Winton's novel Breath, published in 2008. In the passage, the main character, Bruce Pike, recalls an incident at a nearby river. Read the passage carefully, then in a well-written essay, analyze how Winton uses literary elements and techniques to represent the complex response of the narrator to the incident at the riverbank. So again, College Board was not being tricky this year. Standard prompt. Guess what? It's the same as FRQ1. Implicit in every prompt, you have these two questions. What is the authorial intent? And how does the author construct meaning? Kid you not, every single time a kid looks at a poem, a short story, a novel, or a play, for literary analysis, every literary analysis prompt, if it's a well-constructed prompt, has these two questions hidden in the language of the prompt. And if they answer these two questions in the introductory paragraph, they should walk away each time with a solid foundation upon which to build the rest of the essay, as far as landing a thesis statement. So yet again, I'm going to advise them, invert the thesis. Always invert. Unless you have a reason to declare, just invert. Keep it simple. So here it is. What is the authorial intent? It is common knowledge in parenting circles to think that you can't teach children to behave better by making them feel worse. Given this simple truism, it can be understood that when children feel better, they behave better. Tim Winton, however, challenges these tenets through the characters of Loon and Bruce Pike, in that the former relishes and delights in his bad behavior, while Bruce, the spectator, feels an odd mix of pleasure, guilt, shame, and embarrassment. Last sentence, same thing as poetry. How does the author construct meaning? Through the manipulation of irony and paradox, Winton arrives at the strange and albeit liminal space of a child trying to manipulate the power balance that usually separates adults from children. Next one, going to do the exact same thing. So what is the authorial intent in 3 sentences? Last sentence, how does the author construct meaning? Invert the thesis. Free play is important in a child's development because the kid learns how to make decisions independent of the parent, problem solve, and create and abide by a loose set of governing rules. In this space of freedom, kids also learn the rules of how to be an equal, obedient, a subordinate, and a rebel. A part of childhood is learning how to navigate the arbitrary system of rules that define a kid's behavioral patterns, but sometimes kids are just kids and throw everything out the window. And last sentence, same as before. So this is 5 for 5, doing the exact same thing. Winton explores these ideas in his excerpt through the juxtaposition of both characters' reaction to the woman and the paradoxical pull of being caught between childhood and adulthood. And this last one, same thing. Existing simultaneously in the spaces of shame, of guilt, speaks of two contradictory sentiments. The first says, I am bad. The second says, I did something bad. For Loon, his prank is a barrel of laughs that fosters no sense of internal struggle. But for Bruce Pike, this very same prank leaves him feeling an odd pull between shame, guilt, laughter, and an adult understanding of self-awareness. Winton investigates these heartstrings by juxtaposing Loon's reaction to the prank to the reaction of Bruce, and he also does this through a series of contrasting images. So every time you end with those terms and devices to get your thesis. So my students do that all day long for literary analysis. No matter what the genre, no matter what the text, they can do that. So, well, when I do the AP language, you guys that teach that, for rhetorical analysis, you're always going to want to declare the thesis. For synthesis, it's split, it's 50-50. You can declare, you can invert. Persuasion, the same. And for research, you typically want to invert for that. So you need a couple of little paradigms upon which to tackle establishing that thesis up top in the paper. And this inverted method seems to work really well for literary analysis. So the syllogistic method, yet again, I don't need to belabor it. So just in terms of how we're going to construct it for an excerpt, the first premise, yet again, 3 sentences long. It's going to be the statement that contains the terms and devices. The second premise, yet again, is going to be that teeter-totter balance of quoting and paraphrasing, the textual support. And the conclusion is where you're going to keep the promise of the first premise and echo the refrain of the thesis statement, shooting for 10 sentences. So let's take a look at the first 3. Right from the onset, and again, my students are just in the habit of starting right where Winton starts, right? So somebody asked earlier, can they do it by shifts, like work by tackling the shifts? I think it's so much more skillful to do that. But my students, I got them in the habit of just being methodic, be really dutiful in your analysis. But some of my better writers can just proceed through the shifts systematically, which of course is better writing. From the onset, Winton sets the stage for the emotional tug of war Bruce Pike will experience as the result of Loon's prank. Immediately, a series of complex contradictions characterize the setting, which later creates the central conflict of the piece, Bruce's emotional hangover. These strange ironies are woven throughout the text as the external background of the story mirrors Pike's internal struggle. So we have our argument and we have our terms at play in there. Second premise starts at the 4th sentence. Let's go do that teeter-totter balance of quoting and paraphrasing. And we'll see if this student can unpack the diction a little better than the first student. The setting runs parallel to the mood and is in flux as spring gives way to summer, and the crude springboard, brown tannin, cold as hell water simultaneously gives way to a swimming area that is very slow flowing and safe to swim. Nothing is congruent, as are Pike's emotions and reflections upon how to feel about the woman, and that he never had the remotest thing. Yeah, I did read that right. And that he never had the remotest thing in common with Loon except a friendship whose foundation was built upon a mutual admiration of pranking. What ultimately tugs at this passage is the transfer and disbursement of power, a power typically held by adults. Upon seeing that Loon is drowning, apparently, the prank yanks at their own ears as an adult might reprimand a child. But in this case, the binary gets flipped in that Loon is the one controlling the strings. Bruce is torn in that the sluggish water seemed harmless, yet he had no reason to doubt there was a crisis. As Bruce dives into the water, the mere act allows him to become taller all of a sudden as he acts the part of an adult. Let me move this. At this moment, the oscillation of feelings towards the event and the woman begin. Watching Loon go red with pleasure as he exerts all his freckles brings Bruce back down to the size of being a kid. But the adult emotions of feeling more guilt than glee also wash over him. He feels embarrassed for the woman, yet can understand Loon's delight. All right, so again, we got a lot of support, a lot of analysis. We're holding true to the lit terms and the argument in the first premise. So now let's wrap it up. Several emotions and sentiments ride the teeter-totter in this moment. First, the power dynamic shifts back and forth, for at the end, the woman took back some kind of authority. But in this moment, Bruce feels a mix of sympathy and contempt for her. This contradictory pull is what fuels the story, but it's also what drives the internal framework of a kid trying to understand his world. So that's another syllogism. Took, I didn't count that one. It's probably about 10, 11 sentences. And if we go back, this is what when I grade papers, I always go back and say, did you keep the promise of the first premise? Like all your quotes, all your paraphrasing, are they germane to what you're promising up top here? And I think the answer to that is yes. It stays pretty focused. It's pretty cogent. It's pretty disciplined. So I will stop sharing again because we're done with FRQ2 and we can field some questions if there are some.
Okay, we did have a couple of those, sort of an interesting little back and forth here. Someone asked, are general truisms the preferred way to begin an essay? I guess they were referring to some of the way that your students had begun. And another person said they were also curious because in their AP training, they said to avoid generalities at all costs because it was an indication of weaker analysis because it dealt with truisms instead of theme. And do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, so the student, I think they're talking about the second introductory paragraph. I would agree. And, I think the student nonetheless is focusing thematically, but kind of in like this pontificating way. It's kind of, if you knew the personality of the student, you'd be like, oh yeah, I get it. So everything's a truism, everything's emphatically true, empirically true. So that's just kind of the nature of that particular student, and I could not really pull that tendency out of her all year long. So I see the question, do students write one paragraph? My students do 4 paragraphs, intro, 2 bodies, conclusion on the exam.
And you have got that last question. Do you have a formal outline that you give to your students with your premises?
Nope, I do it just like Bob Ross. I show them my examples, my models, how I manipulate the template, and they follow my lead. So here's how I normally do it. So this year I'm doing 11th grade Regents for the first time, and we're starting with The Hate You Give. And I was just reading that, and I was just making my writing workshop for it today. So what I did was, since it's literary analysis, I wrote 3 declarative, and I'll basically say, you don't want to do this. See, it's sloppy. It doesn't yield the thesis comfortably enough. So, avoid the declarative. Here's 3 examples of how to invert it. I wrote all 3. So you've seen it 6 times, invert yours. So as the year progresses, let's say we're doing a poetry unit, and I might say, for my writing workshop where I Bob Ross for you, I'm going to write about sonnet 130, My Mistress's Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun, and I'm going to write about Ozymandias, those 2 poems you cannot write about. Every other poem in the packet is fair game, but you cannot write about what I'm modeling. Otherwise, they just steal from you. They mimic and they steal exactly what you're doing. So for like that 11 Regents class, the first time I write with them, I will write about the hate you give. And then I think they're going to do the perks of being a wallflower next after that. And when I'm doing perks, I'm going to talk about Lord of the Flies, because they read that last year and they'll have recollection of it. So I do not want them to see all the cards up front, because it just lends itself to pure mimicry, and that's where things get to be quite unauthentic.
A couple of people asked if a recording of the lesson will be available.
I'm recording it right now. Yep. And I can put it, I have a YouTube channel, but I can put it in the announcements folder of the group as well. And I know a lot of you guys came in from the AP literature Facebook groups. We have our own group. I started it a couple of months ago called Teachers Teaching Teachers How to Teach Writing. And that's all we really talk about in there. And we have some regulars that pop in. There's this new woman, I was talking to her today. I don't remember her name, but she's the Harvard graduate student who's been making YouTube videos. I think she's going to do some webinars and workshops for us. She seems like an absolute dynamo, and I'm like dying to work with her. So she seems really, really something else. So she's teaching a summer practicum at Harvard. So when she's done with that, she promised to get in touch and we would put something together. Someone's asking, what is her name? Her video is in the group. She posted it last night. It's like Louisa, I think Louisa, and I don't remember the last name. Louisa, I think, is the first name.
I think her channel's Ivy, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, she's super. And Tim Freitas is in our group. I'm friends with Tim. And Brian Tolatino, I'm friends with him. So they're all in our group.
I'm wondering if there are people who would step up who are teaching younger grades.
That would be nice.
No, wouldn't it?
So Alyssa just commented, Alyssa was in my master class. She took that. And one of the things that we do for the younger students is an abridged version of the syllogistic method, because your 7th, 8th, 9th grader ain't going to get their head around that. So it's something that I've called the literary sandwich. They're still writing syllogistically, but they don't know they're writing syllogistically. So it's a real simplified heuristic to get them to be cogent and logical, but they're not going to be as nuanced as an AP literature student. So that's called the literary sandwich. And we go over that in the master class. And when I work with departments and teachers of the lower level, we do that. And sometimes, I mean, we have an open door policy at my school. Anybody can take AP classes. There's no prerequisite for it at all. So sometimes in AP, I actually have to show some students the literary sandwich because the syllogism goes right over their head in September when I first unroll it.
And someone's Haley Murphy wants to know about the masterclass. Is that something that is still available to join? But as Alyssa, is it Alyssa Jenkins? Alyssa Jenkins. She's responding that yeah, it's in the Facebook group. If you watch the Facebook group, right?
Yep. Katrina just put a link in there for my webpage. So it's 9 o'clock and I was only going to go an hour, but I haven't shown you FRQ3. If you're interested in seeing that, stay on. Otherwise, good night. I can go through FRQ3 in literally like 7 minutes because it's the exact same thing as FRQ1, FRQ2. And this is why, my students can write these girthy essays for the exam and do 3 in under 2 hours comfortably, because we practice this all academic year, and it becomes it just becomes kind of common, like just sort of like intuitive and instinctual for them to do it. So let me pull up houses. This was another one that I liked. I thought this was total fair game. Is that visible, Marie?
Yes.
I ask Google Meet questions all the time. I never know if things are visible. So, all right. So FRQ3 dealt with houses. This is the prompt. In many works of fiction, houses take on symbolic importance. Such houses may be literal houses or unconventional ones, like hotels, monasteries, or boats. And when I saw boats, I was like, dude, Life of Pi. That would be awesome to write about for this. That works really well. Either from your own reading or from the list below, choose a work of fiction in which a literal or unconventional house serves as a significant symbol. Then, in a well-written essay, analyze how this house contributes to an interpretation of the work as a whole. Do not merely summarize the plot. Guess what? We're going to invert the thesis. You have to be dutiful to the prompt. Your thesis has to be anchored in the concept of houses. Otherwise, you're not getting the thesis point. But you still can invert the thesis. And let me show you 3 examples here. Willie in Death of a Salesman is unable and unwilling to awaken and witness. Hold on, your pictures are on my screen. Sorry. Willie in Death of a Salesman is unable and unwilling to awaken to witness the nightmare of all of his dreaming, especially his dreams that center upon the literal and figurative home he so desires to make for himself and his family. Having hopes and aspirations is noble, but for men like Willie, they are downright foolish. He deathlessly chases after the phantoms of the American dream and doesn't understand until it's too late that that's exactly what it is, a dream not based in reality. Arthur Miller reminds us of one thing through the symbols that are stored in the Loman home. The promises of America are a lie. So you can, again, just invert every single time for this. So here's another one. They did fences. When it comes to the family unit, boundaries often don't keep others out. They fence you in. In essence, what Troy Maxon needed to do is build a longer family table, not an all-encompassing barrier to safeguard his home. As the play progresses, each of the principal characters come to know an absolute truth. Fear and dishonesty is the highest fence one can possibly erect, whether that home be literal or symbolic in nature. In Fences, Wilson weaves this extended metaphor within the context of the family home, along with the motifs of life and baseball, as well as blues music. So you can see down here, get anchored in the lit terms, just like FRQ1, FRQ2. Last one. Dreams know a secret truth that most humans tend to overlook. Moments of pain are opportunities for growth. It is the nature of some dreams to get crushed, but what fate ushers in is an even better version of the original dream. While all of the principal characters in A Raisin in the Sun have their dreams deferred, what they end up with is a much better thing, a home in which to experience the unconditional love of family. Hansberry conveys this theme through the symbol of Mama's houseplant and the motif of the home. So end with the lit terms, thematic focus in the 3-sentence, end with the lit terms. Exact same thing, exact same template every single time you perform literary analysis. Syllogistic method is going to be used again for the body paragraphs. The only difference is second premise. You don't have the text in front of you. There's no poem, there's no excerpt. You're going to be writing about a play or a novel from recall. So your textual support's coming from your noodle, right? So you have to detail these scenes and detail your textual support. So go through this. Mama's feeble houseplant symbolizes the home she wishes to build for her family, but also her family's deferred dreams for a better future, which struggled to survive and take root in Chicago's South Side in an era of deep racial divide. Her endless devotion to her small houseplant and her dream of procuring a home signifies her constant care for her family and her attention to its dreams. While every principal character witnesses a radical revision of their initial dream, the plant struggles to stay alive, as is juxtaposed to the struggling survival of the individual dreams and family unit. Same thing there, right? So make your argument in 3 sentences, get anchored in your terms and devices. So from here, it's all coming from the head. I think this girl had a quote, and I was like, really? You remembered that? But ordinarily, you're not quoting in FRQ3. But this particular student remembered this line for some reason. Growing doggedly in a small pot by the apartment's kitchen window, Mama's plant has spirit despite the fact that this little old plant ain't never had enough sunshine or nothing. In conjunction with these symbols, the youngers have struggled to overcome their hardships and setbacks, such as racial prejudice that thwart their growth and social mobility. Mama dreams of owning a house with a small garden, and until the play's conclusion, her plant is as close as she ever got to achieving that dream. In the final moments of the play, Mama picks up her plant and leaves the South Side apartment for the last time, showing that this symbol of perseverance will accompany the family as it faces new challenges in Claiborne Park. I'll wrap this up here. We further see this idea at play when gruffly Mama very happily tells Walter to leave her alone while she tends to her plant. Walter's persistent pursuit of his father's life insurance money pulls the family apart and disappoints the sentiments of his mother. In stark contrast, which brings about a resolution to the central conflict, Walter sweetly and playfully begins to sing, and Ruth brings Mama the package that Walter had purchased for the home. This is a moment of reconciliation, a cue that the family has remedied their divide and that they plan to go ahead with Mama's dream of keeping the family united through the purchase of the new home. The gardening tools symbolize the resolution as to what is going to happen to the family's dreams. Now, I'll wrap it up. As we see, the biggest dream of any family is their survival and need to flourish and grow together as a united front beneath one common roof. Mama's unwavering devotion to both her plant and family indicate that this dream is going to come true. In the end, all the stuff of dreams is rendered moot. It's the dream of staying together as one being that truly matters. So all 3 of those essays were written with the exact same templates. All the introductions were using the inverted thesis model, and all the body paragraphs were proceeding syllogistically. And after an academic year with me, that's what my students are doing.
Grace has a question. She said, do you have any tried and true tips for teaching students the fine line between analysis and summary in Q3?
Oh my goodness. It's all in that first premise. So that first premise is essential. Otherwise, it's going to be plot summative. It's, I really hammered it home to my students that you need that first premise. And then again, I don't like giving them paint by numbers, but I'm like, you probably don't want to go over 6 or 7 sentences for that second premise. Otherwise, you're going to get super plot heavy. So you got to choose whatever plot you're adding to your analysis very carefully. Yeah, because there is a very fine line between plot and analysis. But if they're holding true to that first premise, like I keep saying, if they're going to keep the promise of the first premise, then the textual support that they bring in will simultaneously be textual analysis. Anything else? We did okay. All right. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask questions, we could. You're welcome, Lily. You're welcome. All right, it looks like we're done. So yeah, be active in the Facebook group. It's summer. Let's learn, let's grow, let's teach each other. Get more active in there. We've been a little dead in that group with the end of the school year being so hectic.
Christian, I have a question. You indicated that you spend a lot of time with vocabulary. Is there a specific text that you use, or do
Oh,
you have
yes.
lists already? Do you
Yep.
organically with the text that you read?
Yep. There is a book. What's it? It's by David Olson, and it's a book of 3,000 words, and I think it's called The Big Book of Words You Should Know. It's free online. There's a PDF version of it, and I do a ton of vocab with my students because, you know, all of us that have been in the classroom a number of years know that each and every passing year, students are reading far less than they used to. So just in like 5 years ago, 15 years in my career, students were reading more than they are than they are now. So in that book, there's 3,000 words, and I do it as an extra credit opportunity for them. So on Monday, I want them to write down 10 words and properly use them in context. Any 10 out of the 3,000. I'm like, it has to be a good word, something that you would see in a composition or that you would use conversationally. Don't choose, the 17 syllable word that you'll never use. And on Tuesday, they do 10, Wednesday, 10, Thursday, 10, Friday, 10. And it's their vocabulary journal. They submit it to me on Friday. I don't read everything, otherwise I'll be grading all the time. I just give them extra credit when they submit it. So that's thousands of words over the course of an academic year. And then one of the things that I talk about in my master class is this thing called the word slam that we do. And is way too complicated to explain. But I could probably show the group that at some point in time.
I posted the PDF in the chat for you, Grace.
Oh, what's the title of that book? I forgot off the top of my head. I should know. I use it all the time.
It's The Big Book of Words You Should Know.
Yeah, it's awesome. So that's a staple in my class, and Write It Right by Strunk and White. And they're free. They're PDFs online. So
And I also put that PDF in the chat as well a little earlier.
Cool. Thanks. All right. Anything else?
I have a real quick question. I was going to type it, but I think you're going to be gone before I do it.
Oh, go for it.
So I'm intrigued by your journal, the word journal. Is it something that you think you could have them submit every Friday on like Turnitin, so you know that they're creating their own sentences rather than just finding a sentence from the internet?
Yeah, you could. Yes. Yeah, that'd be a good idea. I don't think my students cheated on that, actually.
You must have better students than I.
Yeah, I don't know. I like it never even occurred to me that they would cheat for it. I don't know. They're good little AP kids. They're so innocent, Would they honestly cheat? Would they cheat Mr. Kuhn? Jeez. I would hope not. I think you just deflated my night. I'll ask my AP Lang students, because the lit kids are seniors and they just graduated and left. I'll ask my Lang students next year if they cheated. I'll be like, just be honest. I have good rapport with them. I'll be like, you guys cheat? Like, because if they cheat, they might like copy each other. But yeah, I don't know. The perennial problem of cheating.
I know.
What are we to do?
All right. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
I really think too that because it's extra credit, that if they were going to cheat, they just maybe won't even do it. So maybe that would take away that idea of of them cheating, right? Because it's not going to hurt their grade. It can only help. And, you know, at least for my students, they'd just be like, well, if they felt the need to cheat, they just wouldn't do it since it's extra credit. But I don't know. Maybe that's just mine.
Yeah.
I have a question about, this is Adrian Fisher. I have a question about your examples. Like when you give them, you know, you said 3 inverted introductions and then 3 declarative introductions. How do you keep from giving too much away and making it so that the kids don't have anything that's accessible really to write about?
Yep, I was talking about that earlier. So let's imagine an instance in which I'm teaching poetry, you know, in literature. I don't do units of poetry. I teach poetry all year long. But let's say that we're working on a poetry essay. I might tell the students like, all right, for my Bob Ross examples, I'm going to use Stanley Kunitz's The Portrait and Sylvia Plath's poem Cut. You cannot use The Portrait and you cannot use Cut. Every other poem that we've done in class the last few days, the last few weeks are fair game, but you cannot write about the poems that I'm writing about. And that way, it keeps their essays authentic, because I'm just modeling for them how to manipulate a template. I'm not giving them ideas. You know, I don't want to spoon feed them their own theses and things like that. So it's important that you model something that they're not doing.
So, but what about for like a whole class read? Like if you were teaching like The Awakening or something like that, how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, I talked about that earlier. So next year I'm doing my AP classes, and I have creative writing. And in New York State, we have Regents, which is just general education. So I have 11th grade Regents. And I was looking at the curriculum, and we're going to be doing The Hate You Give as the first novel. So when I'm introducing this stuff, and I'm going to have to do some literary sandwich with that group, I imagine, for the emerging and struggling writers. I will write about The Hate You Give, and there might be a lot of mimicking of me. There might be a lot of copying of me, but I just want them to get comfortable with the template. The second book that we're going to do is The Perks of Being a Wallflower. And as sophomores, they read The Lord of the Flies. So when I Bob Ross my examples, I'm going to write about Lord of the Flies, and they'll have to write about The Perks of Being a Wallflower. Again, they're looking at templates, heuristics, not my ideas.
Thank you.
Did you see Lily's question?
I didn't.
She said, how did you get access to these student essays? Have they been released? I'm dying to see mine.
Nope. I asked I had some students that were done with everything for the academic year. And they were like, my AP kids always want extra credit in Mr. Kuhn's class. Like they're dying to get 100 in class. So I was like, hey, if you could reproduce your essays, then I'll give you some extra credit. So they wrote these after the exam when they came back. Dream students, I know. My kids are awesome. Anything else? All right, I guess we say goodnight. The Phoenix Suns are playing the LA Clippers. Do I create my own curriculum? That's a good question. And it's going to sound arrogant when I say this. We have somebody make our curriculum for us, and nobody knows who that is. Like somebody just like gives us these required course assessments, and in our grade book, we all have to have the same names for our assessments. But, and I'm recording this too, and I'm going to put it on YouTube so my director might see this. I kind of teach, you know, like I really have a hard time with prescribed curriculum, especially when I don't know who's writing it. You know, I got 20 years in the classroom. I have 3 master's degrees. I don't need somebody making my curriculum for me. I understand that we need to be aligned and relatively do the same thing, but I have a teacher skin that I'm very comfortable in. The kids like my teacher skin and how I present. I have good rapport with them. I can't be doing someone else's brainchild in my room. So I kind of do my own thing within the parameters. You know, I want to be compliant and not get, you know, pink letters in my human resources file for being insubordinate. All right. Well, Marie, Katrina, Brian, thank you so much for co-hosting. I truly appreciate it. And I'll be back. We'll do some Lang next time. So for those of you that do Lang, I'll do the exact same thing. So, all right. Good night from here. I'll stay on until the last person's off in case anyone wants to talk. And I'll stop recording.